There is a distinct difference between a person who is angry and a person who has run out of patience. An angry person makes noise. A patient person prints evidence. Welcome back to the archive. I'm Jess, and today's file exposes the dangerous anatomy of community-driven malice. When a group of religious zealots ambushed a grieving 15-year-old girl on her birthday, they believed they were enforcing spiritual justice. They were actually acting on a web of carefully fabricated lies spun by a bitter matriarch. They thought they had the moral high ground. They didn't realize they were dealing with a woman who documents everything. Let's open the file. There are certain kinds of trouble I have learned to anticipate. The slow, structural variety that announces itself weeks in advance, that you can meet with documentation and patience. What happened at the farmer's market that Saturday was the other kind. The kind that finds a 15-year-old girl on her birthday, surrounded by 6 adults, and reduces her to tears over a man who had been dead less than a year. My daughter called me while I was still in the produce section. I heard the crying before she said a word. By the time I reached her, I had already processed the scene with the part of my mind that stays cold when everything else wants to catch fire. 6 women, several of them faces I recognized from the years I had spent attending my ex-husband's church, before I had any reason to understand what kind of community it actually was. They were not shouting exactly. They were doing something more considered. The sustained moral pressure of people who believe they have God and the majority on their side. They told my daughter she was unchristian. They invoked her dead father as a standard she was failing to meet. They suggested that refusing contact with her paternal grandparents was a spiritual deficiency she would one day need to answer for. I placed myself between them and my child. I sent my eldest to the register with her sister's birthday haul and told her to go to the car. Then I turned around. What followed was not my most elegant moment, but it was necessary, and it would not, as it happened, be my most effective one. That evening, once both my daughters were asleep, I went looking for the source, and what I found was so precisely constructed, so carefully dishonest, that it almost demanded a response in kind. I have a contact in that congregation, a reasonable man, the kind that exists in most communities as a quiet counterweight to the louder voices. He told me what I needed to know, and he was apologetic about it in the way that decent people are when they find themselves adjacent to behavior they cannot quite condone. My ex-mother-in-law had posted a comprehensive account of her grievances to the church's private Facebook group. It was, by all accounts, a masterwork of selective suffering. My daughters and I were painted as cruel, ungrateful, and spiritually bankrupt. She described herself and her husband as abandoned and destitute. This despite inheriting her son's personal accounts and his life insurance policy, a fact I noted with a certain dry appreciation. She characterized the affair children as victims of my indifference. And since she could not simultaneously solicit sympathy and expose her son's infidelity being, in this particular congregation, a serious theological violation, she had introduced a creative revision. The other woman had been my surrogate. I had rejected the boys because I had wanted daughters. I read this twice. I thought about my girls. The older one who had discovered the affair, who had come to me shaking, who still carries that weight in her shoulders when she thinks no one is watching. I thought about the message sent 2 days after their father's funeral, telling them his death was their fault. The congregation believed the story completely. They were rallying with considerable enthusiasm. I had every document I needed already printed and organized from the divorce proceedings that his death had interrupted. I had not gone looking for this fight, but I had, without knowing it, been preparing for it for the better part of a year. I took a personal day. I drove to the print shop with a folder that represented approximately 18 months of documented marriage collapse, and I asked them to reproduce everything on their highest quality paper stock. Photographs, text message threads, emails, the confirmation in writing from my ex-in-laws themselves that they had known about the affair and chosen to support it. The messages to my daughters, the ones calling them names I will not repeat here, the ones holding 2 grieving teenagers responsible for their father's choices. I spent the better part of the evening at my kitchen table with a craft knife, a bone folder, and a printer. The final product was a small, modest booklet. The kind that sits in a neat stack at the back of a church hall next to the hymn sheets. Available for anyone who needs one. Understated cover. Clean layout. The sort of thing that gets picked up without a second thought. The first interior page, once you opened it, was a photograph taken in my living room. My ex-husband and a woman who was clearly and unambiguously not me. Different complexion. Different hair. The caption was simple, their names and the phrase "love story" underneath. I thought that was sufficient. I drove to the church early the following Sunday morning, before the congregation arrived, and placed a small number of them in the stack at the literature table at the back. I did not linger. I did not sign anything. I drove home, made coffee, and waited for the information economy to do what it does. It did not take long. By the time the service ended, the congregation was not discussing Sunday scripture, and my ex-mother-in-law's carefully constructed narrative had developed a significant structural problem. The congregation did not, ultimately, absolve me. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters to tell this accurately. The general consensus, from what filtered back to me, was that my divorce had been understandable given the circumstances, but that I had perhaps failed in some fundamental wifely capacity before the crisis arrived. I found this assessment neither surprising nor particularly wounding. I had not designed the booklets to earn their approval. I had designed them to dismantle a specific lie that was being used to harm my children. On that narrower objective, the results were thorough. The language directed at my ex-husband and his affair partner became so severe that the pastor himself was required to intervene and moderate the Facebook group. My ex-in-laws, who had not 2 weeks prior been receiving an outpouring of community support, were asked in the diplomatic language churches use for these situations to reflect privately. They left the congregation. My ex-mother-in-law made one final post on her personal page about loneliness and ingratitude, mourning a son who would have cared for her. She did not mention what his care would have been financed with, since I had been the primary earner throughout the marriage. 2 handwritten apology letters arrived for my daughters. They were not from the grandparents. I filed them in a folder, in the same cabinet where I keep the custody court documents. Everything organized. Everything labeled. My daughters do not know the details of what I did, and they do not need to. My job is not to narrate my moves to them. My job is simply to make sure the board stays clear. The custody case is still ongoing. I am not concerned. I have always kept very thorough records. The congregation wanted a villain. Instead, they received an indisputable, beautifully formatted dossier of truth. My favorite detail of this file isn't the destruction of the grandmother's social status. It's the clinical precision of the delivery. No screaming on the church steps. No public scenes. Just a small, modest booklet left next to the hymn sheets, letting the natural curiosity of a gossip-hungry crowd do the heavy lifting. When you weaponize a lie against someone's children, you better pray they don't keep receipts. If you want to study another masterclass in silent execution, select the next file on your screen right now. The archive is always open. Stay vigilant.